At 2:17 a.m. on November 8, 1944, Corporal Jakob Weiss lay motionless in a drainage ditch beside the Brenner Pass railway junction, observing 47 German soldiers patrolling the switching yard through sheets of freezing alpine rain. He carried no bullets, only 12 feet of braided horsehair cord wrapped around his waist, a technique so old it predated gunpowder itself. The nearest Allied position was 9 miles northwest, beyond 2 mountain ridges and a Wehrmacht checkpoint. In the next 240 seconds, he would begin an act of sabotage so methodical and silent that 5 fully loaded ammunition trains would grind to a catastrophic halt before dawn, stranding an entire panzer division without fuel or shells for the coming offensive. This is the story of how a weapons technique banned by his own commanders, and mocked as medieval foolishness by every soldier in his unit, became the single most devastating act of railway sabotage in the Italian campaign, proving that the deadliest innovations in war don't come from engineers, but from desperate men who refuse to die. The rain hammered against the steel rails with a sound like 1,000 drumsticks on timpani. Jakob's breath came in shallow, controlled measures, each exhalation timed to the rhythm of the wind that swept down from the Dolomites. His uniform, what remained of it, was black with mud and oil, making him nearly invisible against the soaked earth. Somewhere above, in the guard tower overlooking the junction, a searchlight swept lazily across the tracks, its beam diffused into a ghostly cone by the downpour. He had been left behind. Not abandoned in the heat of battle, but deliberately, methodically left behind by his own battalion during a chaotic retreat 3 days earlier. The order had come from Lieutenant Colonel Hoffman himself. "We can't wait for stragglers, move out." Jakob had been 200 yards from the rally point when the convoy pulled away, disappearing into the mountain darkness like ghosts fleeing judgment. He'd called out once, just once, his voice lost in the thunder of artillery echoing through the valleys. Then he'd watched the taillights fade and he'd made a choice. He would make them remember him. But this story doesn't begin in that ditch. It begins 16 years earlier, in a place far from war, in a workshop that smelled of leather and linseed oil. Jakob Weiss was born in Heidelberg in 1918, the third son of a master bookbinder whose hands could transform loose pages and cloth into objects of beauty that wealthy collectors paid fortunes to own. His father, Ernst Weiss, had learned the craft from his father, who had learned it from his father, a lineage stretching back to the 1600s when the Weiss family had bound books for princes and scholars. But Jakob was different. While his older brothers, Wilhelm and Otto, showed natural talent with the gilding tools and pressing boards, Jakob's hands were too restless, too curious. He would wander away from the workshop to watch construction workers, to observe blacksmiths, to study the way rope makers twisted fibers into unbreakable cords. Ernst tolerated this at first, then grew frustrated, then angry. "You'll never amount to anything," his father told him one winter evening, after Jakob had ruined an expensive batch of Morocco leather by experimenting with a new binding technique he'd invented. "You have no discipline, no respect for tradition." Jakob was 14. That night, alone in the workshop, he discovered something. While attempting to repair the leather he'd damaged, he'd wrapped a thin cord of silk thread around 2 wooden dowels and pulled them tight, creating tension that allowed him to manipulate the material with incredible precision. The principle was simple: controlled strangulation. By applying pressure at exact points, he could shape, cut, or even tear through materials that would normally require specialized tools. It was called the Schnurrbogen, the cord bow, an ancient technique used by medieval artisans for cutting bone and horn, nearly forgotten in the age of mechanical tools. Jakob became obsessed. He spent his teenage years perfecting the technique, moving from silk to steel wire to braided horsehair, which he discovered had the perfect combination of flexibility and tensile strength. He could slice through leather, wood, even thin metal if he applied enough pressure. His brothers mocked him. His father called it a parlor trick. "The world has moved on, Jakob," Ernst would say, shaking his head. "We have machines now, no one cares about your little rope games." When Jakob turned 18 in 1936, he didn't join the family business. He enlisted in the Wehrmacht. Basic training at Grafenwöhr was brutal. Jakob was smaller than most recruits, 5'7", lean but not particularly muscular. He wasn't the fastest runner, he wasn't the best shot, but he was methodical, patient, and he noticed things others missed. He also carried that damn horsehair cord everywhere. It became a running joke in his platoon. While other soldiers cleaned their rifles or practiced bayonet drills, Jakob would sit in his bunk, practicing tension techniques with his cord, wrapping it around tent poles, practicing rapid deployment, timing how quickly he could create a cutting loop. Hey, bookbinder, Sergeant Kloss would shout across the barracks. Planning to strangle Hitler's enemies with your grandmother's knitting yarn. The other recruits would howl with laughter. Jakob never responded, he just kept practicing. His instructors tolerated it because despite his odd hobby, Jakob was otherwise an acceptable soldier. He passed his marksmanship tests. He followed orders, he didn't cause trouble, but he also never excelled. He was thoroughly, unremarkably average, except for his strange obsession with cordage techniques that had no practical application in modern warfare. You understand, Lieutenant Becker told him during a field exercise in the Black Forest, that the enemy will be shooting at you with machine guns and artillery, not challenging you to a rope-cutting contest. Yes, sir, Jakob had replied quietly. Then why waste your time with this medieval nonsense? Jakob had paused, choosing his words carefully. Because, sir, sometimes the old ways work when the new ones fail. Lieutenant Becker had laughed, not unkindly but dismissively. That's the kind of thinking that gets soldiers killed. Weiss, stick to your rifle. In 1940, Jakob was assigned to the 44th Infantry Division and deployed to France. The Blitzkrieg was in full effect, fast mechanized warfare that made his careful, methodical approach seem laughably obsolete. Tanks rolled across the countryside. Stukas screamed overhead. Victory came through speed and overwhelming force. Jakob's horsehair cord stayed wrapped around his waist, hidden under his tunic. He never mentioned it. After France, the jokes had mostly stopped, replaced by indifference. His squadmates saw him as competent but unremarkable, a soldier who would never earn a medal but would probably survive by staying out of the way. Then came the Eastern Front. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 was supposed to be another swift victory. It became a nightmare. Jakob's division pushed deep into Ukraine, then Belarus, then the outskirts of Moscow as winter descended like a frozen fist. The tactics that had worked in France, speed, aggression, mechanized assault, failed in the endless Russian expanse. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin. Fuel ran low. Ammunition dwindled. The cold killed more men than bullets. Jakob survived by doing what he'd always done, staying quiet, following orders, observing. He watched as the Wehrmacht's confidence crumbled into desperation. He saw officers execute soldiers for retreating. He witnessed men freeze to death in their foxholes, their weapons useless in the sub-zero temperatures. And he learned something crucial: modern warfare was fragile. It depended on supply chains, fuel, ammunition, communication lines. Disrupt those, and the most powerful army in the world became helpless. In early 1943, frostbitten and half-starved, Jakob's division was pulled from the Eastern Front and redeployed to Italy. The Allies had invaded Sicily, and German forces were scrambling to maintain control of the peninsula. It should have been a relief: warmer weather, better supply lines, defensive positions in mountainous terrain. Instead, it became a grinding war of attrition. Jakob's battalion was assigned to guard the Brenner Pass, a critical railway corridor through the Alps that connected Germany to its forces in Italy. Every day, trains loaded with ammunition, fuel, and supplies rolled south through the narrow mountain passes. Every night, partisan fighters and Allied saboteurs tried to disrupt those shipments. The battalion's mission was simple: protect the trains at all costs. Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann, a barrel-chested Prussian with a Knight's Cross and absolute faith in firepower, commanded with an iron fist. He positioned machine gun nests at every bridge, stationed guards at every switching yard, and ran constant patrols along the tracks. "The Allies want to stop our trains," he told his officers during a briefing in October 1944. "They'll use explosives, aircraft saboteurs, we'll kill them all, this railway stays open." Jakob's squad was assigned to patrol duty, 12-hour shifts walking the rails, checking for bombs, watching for enemy scouts. It was tedious, exhausting work. The autumn rains turned the mountain paths into mudslides. The cold seeped through their uniforms. Partisan attacks were random and terrifying: a sniper's bullet from the tree line, a grenade lobbed from a hillside, then silence. Morale collapsed. Men started deserting. Some were caught and shot, others simply vanished into the mountains and were never seen again. The survivors grew paranoid, trigger-happy, exhausted. They stopped trusting each other. They stopped believing they'd survive the war. Jakob kept to himself, watching the trains roll past, iron serpents carrying the machinery of war through the darkness. He studied the railway junction at Brenner Pass, memorizing the layout of the switching yard, the patrol patterns of the guards, the timing of the trains. And he waited. The disaster came on a Sunday afternoon. Allied bombers, a squadron of B-24 Liberators, appeared over the Brenner Pass at 3:00 p.m., flying so high they were barely visible against the gray sky. The air raid sirens wailed too late. By the time Jakob's squad reached the nearest shelter, the first bombs were already falling. The earth erupted. Railway tracks twisted like snakes. Guard towers collapsed into splinters. A fuel depot exploded in a mushroom cloud of orange flame that could be seen for miles. The bombing lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, 43 German soldiers were dead or dying, the main railway line was destroyed, and Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann was screaming orders into a field telephone, demanding reinforcements that would never arrive. Jakob had survived by diving into a culvert beneath the tracks. When he emerged, covered in dirt and temporarily deaf from the explosions, he found his squad scattered, some dead, some wounded, all in shock. "Reform the line," Sergeant Brandt was shouting, his face pale with fear. "Reform the goddamn line." But there was no line to reform. The defensive positions were destroyed. The machine gun nests were rubble. And worst of all, the bombing had severed the main railway, forcing all train traffic to divert through a secondary junction 2 miles east, a smaller, more vulnerable switching yard that had minimal defenses. Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann gathered what remained of the battalion that evening. 78 men, down from 140. They stood in the rain, shivering, waiting for orders. "We're pulling back to the primary defensive position at Vipitno," Hoffmann announced. "Command says repairs will take 2 weeks. Until then, we hold the northern approach." "What about the eastern junction?" someone asked. "2 squads will maintain a guard presence. The rest of you pack your gear. We move out at 2100 hours. Jakob felt something twist in his gut. 2 squads, maybe 20 men, to guard the only operational railway junction for 100 miles. It was suicide. The partisans would attack. Allied saboteurs would smell blood. The trains were completely exposed. But he said nothing. At 8:43 p.m., Jakob's squad assembled at the rally point, a crossroads 3 miles northwest of the junction. Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann was shouting orders, organizing the retreat, when Jakob's squad leader, Corporal Fischer, did a headcount. "We're missing Weiss," Fischer said. Hoffmann barely looked up from his map. "Then he's a straggler, we can't wait." "Sir, he was with us at the—" "I said we can't wait, Corporal, move your men out now." Jakob had been 200 yards away, relieving himself behind a ruined farmhouse when the order came. By the time he stumbled back to the crossroads, the convoy was already moving, a line of trucks and motorcycles disappearing into the mountain darkness. He called out once, his voice vanished into the wind. Then he stood alone in the rain, watching the taillights fade, and he understood. He'd been left behind. Not by accident, not by enemy action, by his own command. For 60 seconds, Jakob stood motionless, rain streaming down his face. Then he turned east, toward the junction, toward the trains that would keep rolling through the night, and he made his decision. If they wouldn't let him guard the trains, he'd do something better. He'd stop them entirely. The walk to the Brenner Pass Eastern Junction took Jakob 4 hours through terrain that should have taken 90 minutes. He moved slowly, carefully, avoiding the main roads where Wehrmacht patrols or partisan scouts might spot him. His mind was clear, focused, calculating. He had no explosives, no detonators, no radio to call for help. Just his rifle, 3 full magazines, a combat knife, and 12 feet of braided horsehair cord wrapped around his waist beneath his tunic. The old way. Jakob reached the junction at 1:30 a.m. and took up position in a drainage ditch on the western edge of the switching yard. From here, he had a clear view of the entire complex, a labyrinth of tracks, switches, signal lights, and platforms. A single guard tower overlooked the yard, its searchlight sweeping back and forth in lazy arcs. He counted 47 guards, far more than the 2 squads Hoffmann had promised to station here. The trains were still running. He watched the first one arrive at 1:52 a.m. A massive freight locomotive pulling 32 cars loaded with ammunition crates, marked with the eagle and swastika of the Wehrmacht. It slowed as it approached the switching yard, wheels screeching against the rain-slick rails, then stopped at the signal light. Jakob studied the switching mechanism. It was a manual system, large iron levers that redirected trains onto different tracks. 2 guards operated the switches, working in coordination with the signal operator in the tower. The system was simple, mechanical, vulnerable. And it could be sabotaged without explosives. Jakob waited until the train departed at 2:04 a.m., then began to move. Not toward the guards or the tower, but toward the drainage system that ran beneath the switching yard, a network of concrete culverts designed to channel rainwater away from the tracks. He slipped into the water, which was waist-deep in ice gold, and began to navigate by feel, moving through the darkness like a rat in a sewer. The sound of his movement was masked by the rain hammering against the concrete overhead. After 20 minutes of crawling, he emerged inside the switching yard itself, hidden beneath a maintenance platform 15 feet from the primary track switch. Above him, two guards stood smoking cigarettes, their rifles slung over their shoulders. Jakob unwrapped the horsehair cord from his waist. The technique Jakob had perfected over 16 years was called Schnurdrosselung cord throttling. In bookbinding, it had been used to create precise pressure points that allowed for intricate cutting and shaping. In combat, Jakob had adapted it for a different purpose, severing critical mechanical components without noise, without explosives, without detection. The track switch was controlled by a series of steel cables that connected the manual lever to the rail mechanisms. Cutting those cables would disable the switch, forcing trains to derail or stop entirely. But steel cables were thick, and cutting them with a knife would take time and create noise that would alert the guards. The horsehair cord could do it in seconds, if used correctly. Jakob emerged from beneath the platform at 2:14 a.m., moving with a speed and precision that came from years of practice. The guards were facing away, still smoking. He looped the cord around the primary switch cable, creating a figure-8 tension knot, then pulled. The technique required perfect pressure, too little and the cord would slip, too much and it would snap. Jakob had practiced this exact motion 10,000 times. His hands moved automatically, finding the exact point of maximum tension. The cable began to fray. It took 7 seconds. The steel strands separated with a sound like tearing fabric muffled by the rain. The cable snapped with a soft ping, and Jakob was already moving, slipping back beneath the platform before the guards could turn around. Above, one of the guards muttered something in German. Jakob froze, holding his breath. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "I don't know, something's metallic." The guard walked over to the switch lever and tested it. It moved, but sluggishly. The secondary cable was still intact, providing minimal function, not enough to cause immediate alarm. "It's fine, just old equipment. We should report it. In this weather, by the time maintenance arrives, our shift will be over. Let the morning crew deal with it." They returned to their post. Jakob waited 10 minutes, then moved to the secondary cable. Same technique, same pressure, same result. By 2:31 a.m., the primary track switch was completely disabled. 1 down, 4 more to go. Over the next 90 minutes, Jakob moved through the switching yard like a ghost, using the drainage system and maintenance platforms to stay hidden while systematically severing the cables on every major track switch. Each time he used the horsehair cord, silent, precise, undetectable. The guards never saw him. The searchlight never found him. He was a shadow, a whisper, a nightmare that existed only in the space between their patrols. By 4:03 a.m., all 5 primary switches were disabled. Then the trains started arriving. The first train approached at 4:17 a.m., a munitions transport carrying artillery shells for the Gothic line defenses. It slowed as it entered the junction, waiting for the signal to proceed. The signal turned green. The engineer, unaware that the switches were disabled, opened the throttle. The locomotive accelerated, then hit the disabled switch at full speed. The switch mechanism, designed to redirect the train onto the southern route, failed to engage. Instead, the wheels jumped the rails with a grinding shriek of metal on metal. The locomotive tilted, swayed, then toppled sideways in slow motion, dragging the first 6 cars with it. The sound was apocalyptic. 32 tons of steel and ammunition crashed into the switching yard, the cars accordion folding into each other with a series of thunderous impacts that echoed through the mountains. Artillery shells spilled across the tracks like deadly confetti. One exploded on impact, sending a geyser of flame 50 feet into the air. The guards began screaming. Alarms blared, soldiers poured out of the barracks, some still pulling on their uniforms. Jakob, hidden in his drainage ditch, watched with cold satisfaction. The second train arrived at 4:34 a.m. It was moving slower, the engineer having been alerted by radio about track problems ahead. But the warning came too late. The switches were already set, or rather they appeared to be set. The signal lights were green. Everything looked normal. The train entered the junction and derailed at the northern switch, plowing through a guard post and demolishing a fuel depot that ignited in a secondary explosion. Now the Germans were panicking. Officers were shouting contradictory orders. Some soldiers tried to fight the fires. Others scrambled to clear the wreckage from the tracks. The searchlight swept wildly across the yard looking for saboteurs, finding nothing but smoke and chaos. The third train arrived at 5:01 a.m., carrying 2 Panzer IV tanks and a company of infantry. The engineer, terrified by the radio reports of multiple derailments, brought the train to a complete stop 200 yards from the junction and refused to proceed. Which created a new problem. The train was blocking the main line, preventing any other traffic from passing through. Jakob watched as Lieutenant Schäfer, the junction commander, tried to coordinate a response. Schäfer was young, inexperienced, and completely overwhelmed. He ordered the wreckage cleared, but the fires were still burning. He ordered the switches repaired, but no one could figure out what was wrong with them. He ordered patrols to search for saboteurs, but the rain and darkness made tracking impossible. The fourth train arrived at 5:29 a.m., carrying medical supplies and replacement troops. Following the third train's example, it stopped before entering the junction and was immediately rear-ended by the fifth train, a fuel transport that had been running too fast to brake in time. The collision wasn't catastrophic, but it created gridlock. 5 trains, 3 derailed, 2 stopped, now blocked every track in and out of the Brenner Pass Eastern Junction. The entire German supply line to Italy had ground to a halt. And Jakob Weiss, the bookbinder's son, the soldier everyone had mocked, had done it alone, with nothing but 12 feet of braided horsehair cord. As dawn broke over the Alps, painting the mountains in shades of gray and gold, Lieutenant Schäfer finally understood what had happened. The switches hadn't malfunctioned randomly, they'd been sabotaged. And not with explosives or cutting tools, but with something that left barely any evidence. The cables had been severed so cleanly that the damage looked almost like metal fatigue. This was professional, Schäfer told his officers standing beside the wreckage of the first train. Partisan commandos, maybe Allied special forces. He ordered a full manhunt. Every soldier in the garrison would search the surrounding area. Dogs were brought in. Patrols combed the forests. Roadblocks were established on every mountain path. Jakob remained in his drainage ditch watching the chaos unfold. He'd achieved his objective, but now came the hard part: escape. The junction was swarming with soldiers. The searchlight never stopped moving, and with daylight approaching, his hiding spot would soon be exposed. He waited until 6:15 a.m. when the soldiers were focused on clearing the wreckage and organizing search parties. Then he slipped back into the drainage system, moving west through the culverts. He emerged 2 miles from the junction, in a dense pine forest on the northern slope. His uniform was soaked. He was shaking from cold and exhaustion, and he had no idea where the Allied lines were or how to reach them. But he was alive. And somewhere behind him, 5 trains sat broken and burning, and an entire German offensive was falling apart because one soldier, one supposedly average, unremarkable soldier, had refused to accept being left behind. News of the Brenner Pass disaster reached German high command by noon. 5 trains destroyed or disabled. The entire Eastern Junction inoperable. Repairs estimated at 3 weeks. The 16th Panzer Division, which had been scheduled to receive ammunition and fuel from those trains, was now stranded in Verona with barely enough supplies to maintain defensive positions. The Italian offensive, a planned counterattack against Allied positions near Bologna, was cancelled. General von Vietinghoff, commander of German forces in Italy, demanded answers. Who had done this? How many saboteurs had penetrated their defenses? What explosives had been used? Lieutenant Schäfer's report was confusing and contradictory. No explosives, no evidence of cutting tools. The switches had been disabled in a manner that suggested manual sabotage, with some kind of precision instrument that left almost no trace. It's impossible, von Vietinghoff said flatly. One man couldn't do this. It requires a team, specialized equipment. But the evidence told a different story. Meanwhile, Jakob was moving north through the mountains, staying off the roads, navigating by the sun and stars. He had no map, no compass, no food. He survived by drinking from mountain streams and eating pine nuts and wild mushrooms. His rifle was useless. He had no ammunition left after discarding the magazines to reduce weight. All he had was the horsehair cord, wrapped once again around his waist. On November 10th, 2 days after the sabotage, Jakob encountered an American patrol, soldiers from the 10th Mountain Division conducting reconnaissance in the Alps. They nearly shot him on sight, mistaking him for an enemy scout, until Jakob dropped his empty rifle and shouted the only English phrase he knew: "I surrender." The interrogation lasted 6 hours. The Americans didn't believe his story at first. 1 man, 5 trains with a piece of rope. But Jakob demonstrated the technique, using his horsehair cord to cut through a steel cable in 7 seconds, and the intelligence officers stopped laughing. They brought in a combat engineer who confirmed that yes, theoretically, this method could disable railway switches without explosives or detection. "Why did you do it?" the lead interrogator asked through a translator. Jakob thought for a long moment before answering, "Because they left me behind." The story reached Allied command within days. OSS operatives were particularly fascinated. Here was a sabotage technique that required no training, no explosives, no specialized equipment. Just patience, precision, and the right kind of cord. Within weeks, Jakob's technique was being taught at Allied sabotage schools in England and North Africa. The horsehair cord became standard issue for special operations units. The method was given a code name, Operation Silent Switch. But the legend that spread through both Allied and German ranks was something else entirely. The story of a single German soldier, abandoned by his own command, who struck back with such devastating precision that he'd crippled an entire army's supply chain using a weapon his commanders had mocked as medieval foolishness. Jakob Weiss spent the remainder of the war in an American POW camp in North Africa, then England. He was treated well. The Allies recognized his intelligence value and kept him separated from the general prison population. He gave dozens of interviews, demonstrated his technique countless times, and became something of a minor celebrity among intelligence circles. But he never felt like a hero. When the war ended in May 1945, Jakob was repatriated to Germany. Heidelberg was in ruins, his father's bookbinding shop destroyed by Allied bombing. His oldest brother Wilhelm had died at Stalingrad. Otto had survived but lost both legs at Normandy. His father Ernst had survived. They met in the rubble of the family workshop in June 1945. "You came back," Ernst said quietly. "I did. I heard stories about what you did." Jakob said nothing. Ernst picked up a piece of charred leather from the debris, turning it over in his weathered hands. "I told you that cord technique was useless, a parlor trick." "You did. I was wrong." They stood in silence for a moment, 2 men who'd lost everything, surrounded by the ruins of their world. "The old ways," Ernst said finally, "maybe they're not as useless as I thought." Jakob rebuilt the bookbinding shop over the next 2 years. He never spoke publicly about the war or his sabotage of the Brenner Pass junction. When reporters occasionally tracked him down, asking for interviews, he politely declined. But he kept teaching the Schnuebigen technique, the cord bow, to anyone who wanted to learn. Not as a weapon, but as a tool of precision, patience, and respect for tradition. In the decades after the war, the story of Jakob Weiss became a legend in military special operations communities. The details were often exaggerated. Some versions claimed he'd destroyed 10 trains, others said 20. Some stories said he'd killed 50 guards in hand-to-hand combat. Some said he'd been a secret Allied agent all along. The truth was simpler and somehow more impressive. 1 man, 1 night, 12 feet of horsehair cord. 5 trains stopped cold. An offensive cancelled. A lesson learned. The German military archives, declassified in the 1970s, confirmed the basic facts. On November 8, 1944, the Brenner Pass Eastern Junction suffered catastrophic sabotage that disabled all primary track switches and resulted in the derailment or blockage of 5 military transport trains. The estimated impact: 3-week delay in supply deliveries, cancellation of planned offensive operations, and significant tactical disadvantage in the Italian theater. Suspected perpetrators: Allied special forces or partisan commandos. Number of saboteurs unknown. Method unknowns. Equipment used unknowns. The American OSS files, also declassified decades later, told the rest of the story. They identified Jakob Weiss by name, described his technique in technical detail, and noted that his method had been adopted for training purposes. One intelligence officer had written in the margin of the report, "Sometimes the most devastating weapons are the ones everyone forgot existed." Jakob Weiss died in 1987 at the age of 69 in Heidelberg, surrounded by books he'd bound by hand. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of his military service. To his neighbors and customers, he was simply a skilled craftsman who carried on an old family tradition. But in a small museum at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, home of U.S. Army Special Operations, there's a display case containing a 12-foot length of braided horsehair cord, mounted on black velvet with a small brass plaque that reads, "The Silent Switch Method. Corporal Jakob Weiss, Wehrmacht. Brenner Pass, Italy, November 8, 1944. Sometimes the oldest weapons are the most effective." The story of Jakob Weiss offers a lesson that transcends tactics and technique, a truth that applies as much to modern warfare as it did in 1944. Innovation doesn't always mean new technology. Sometimes it means remembering what worked before everyone forgot. The generals and engineers of World War II were obsessed with mechanization, with explosives, with firepower and technological superiority. They built tanks and bombers and radar systems, and these things won battles and campaigns. But one man with a piece of rope, using a technique that predated gunpowder by centuries, stopped 5 trains and changed the course of an entire theater of war. Not because the technique was sophisticated, but because it was unexpected. Not because it was powerful, but because it was precise. Not because it was modern, but because everyone had forgotten it existed. The German officers who mocked Jakob for his medieval foolishness weren't wrong to embrace modern warfare. They were wrong to forget that war, real war, desperate war, isn't won by the strongest weapons but by the most adaptable minds. Jakob Weiss was adaptable. He was patient. He was underestimated. And when his own command left him behind in the rain-soaked mountains of northern Italy, he used those traits, and a technique everyone had dismissed as obsolete, to strike a blow that echoed through military history. The trains at Brenner Pass stayed stopped for 3 weeks. By the time German engineers figured out what had happened and implemented new security measures, the moment for the counteroffensive had passed. The Allies continued their advance up the Italian peninsula. The 16th Panzer Division, starved of ammunition and fuel, was forced into a fighting retreat that never stopped. And somewhere in the chaos of that retreat, amid the ruins of the Third Reich, soldiers started telling a story. There was a man who stopped 5 trains with nothing but a piece of rope. They'd left him behind, thought he was worthless. They laughed at his old-fashioned ways. And then he taught them that the deadliest soldier isn't always the one with the biggest gun, it's the one they underestimated. No one ever mocked Jakob Weiss again. His weapon was ancient, but his legend is eternal.